Okay, so the lectures this year, as I understand, are all about the reception of antiquity, and I have chosen, being a classical archaeologist, I have chosen the reception of Greek art in Roman culture, and I would like to focus on collecting art in Roman villas, but also reach out a little bit more and discuss some elements of this reception which may not necessarily be so well known generally. Okay. Just as a very brief introduction, can you see the screen? Can you read what is written there? I mean, not I'm going to talk about everything, so it's not essential that you can read the text. But as I'm speaking in English, I thought it might be easier for you also if you have a few notes on the slide alongside. I am not going to talk a lot about how the Greeks, how the Romans got to know Greek art. I assume that you already know something about this aspect. When the Roman Empire expanded, first on the peninsula of Italy, into the south of Italy, which was inhabited to a large extent by Greeks in the Greek colonies. And then later, when they also expanded into the eastern part of the Greek-speaking eastern part of the Mediterranean, the Romans encountered what was not so much an entirely new kind of culture, because there had been connections at least since the 6th century BC. But they accounted a very different art of a very different kind of display of art in marble, but mostly in bronze, which is why, unfortunately, this art is mainly lost to us. And when they had conquered these cities, they brought not only all sorts of booty, weapons and coined money and precious objects made of gold and silver, and all the stuff that was normally taken away when someone conquered another city. But they also brought back what we would call art in huge numbers and in great quantities. And I have put here on the slide only some examples with the references from ancient authors. So one of the earliest examples, oh, this is very strange. Some of the earliest examples is the victory of Marcellus over Syracuse in Sicily in 207. Sorry, that should read 211. There is an error here. In 211 BC, where Plutarch tells us that he brought back the most beautiful public monuments. And in this context, public monuments obviously refers to portable monuments, which essentially are statues, but also paintings. And we see that in some of the other writers as well. Livy, for instance, tells us that 2 years later, Fabius Maximus, who conquered Tarentum, brought a similar amount of statues and paintings. And this is perhaps the first thing to note, which is not so often mentioned, which is that the Romans took not just statues, but they also took lots and lots of paintings, which they valued as much as they did statues. One reason why we today talk much less about the paintings is that these paintings are, of course, all lost because they were painted on wood or other perishable materials. And so none of this has been preserved except for the textual references in these Greek and Latin authors of the imperial period, and they were often not very precise around this, and so it doesn't seem to be so interesting for modern scholars. But we shouldn't forget that for the Romans, these paintings were also extremely valuable. There were then, when the Romans also moved towards the Greek East, they plundered all the cities which they conquered to various degrees. Not all Roman generals took as much booty as others. But we have some, again, from Pliny, this information when Flaminius defeated Philip of Macedon, so the Macedonian king in 194 BCE. He took a lot of art, not only from the public sanctuaries and public places in the cities, but also from the Macedonian palaces, which were filled with artwork. This is, of course, something that they could not find in other places such as Athens, because there were no kings. But when they moved on to conquer the Greek East, where there were Hellenistic palaces of the Hellenistic kings, they plundered these palaces as well. And we have a very interesting detail here about Aemilius Paulus' triumphal procession in Rome after his victory at Pydna in 168, where, so at least Plutarch tells us, he had taken so many statues and paintings that he needed 250 wagons to carry them and display them through the cities of Rome, and that apparently this took more than a day to actually parade all these beautiful things through the city of Rome on the occasion of his triumph. This whole looting of the cities and palaces in the Greek East and in Italy ended more or less after the sack of Corinth in 146 by the general Mummius, who is said to have filled the whole of Italy with statues and paintings. Of course, this must refer to the parts of Italy which by that time were already regarded as part of, you know, the Roman, you know, the cities associated with the Romans. But we get some idea of what was going on there, mainly in the second century, late third and in the second century BCE. So through these victories, lots and lots of statues and paintings came to Rome and were then sometimes distributed to other places on the Italian peninsula. Most of these most of these then ended up in Rome in public places, and we are going to talk about this in a moment. However, and these materials were considered extremely valuable, both by the Italian cities that displayed these artworks, but also by private individuals. So by the generals, by the noble families, who through their involvement in the military campaigns also took part of this booty to display it in their own houses and villas. This was a very contested thing to do, as we will see in a minute. But after the sacking of cities came to an end, more or less, because, you know, the Greek East had been conquered and then this stopped. There was still a lot of demand for Greek art, in particular on the part of of private individuals, so for their private houses and villas. And so in the wake of this developed also an industry of production of new Greek art, both in Greece itself. So you may be familiar with the letters of Cicero, where he asks his friend Atticus in Athens to send him statues to furnish Cicero's villas and the various spaces in his villas. So there was a lot of antiquities trade starting, some of which initially certainly was produced in Greece itself, in particular in Athens. Athens was considered as the place where one could commission the best Greek art that one could get, but also slowly but surely there were Greek artists moving to Italy, in particular to the Greek-speaking parts of southern Italy, and even more specifically to Campania, where Greek art was then produced on Italian soil. But we have evidence for the trading and shipping of Greek art also through archaeological evidence, not just through the literary sources. And that evidence comes mostly from shipwrecks. Lots of shipwrecks have been found off the coast of Greece, off the coast of Italy. You surely know the famous Riace bronzes, which have been found off the coast of Italy, a rare example of bronze statues that have survived, because the bronze statues have mostly been molten down in later centuries and so are not preserved. But through these shipwrecks, we have some evidence for how this material was shipped around the Mediterranean and mostly towards Italian markets, and then later on also to southern France and to Spain and to some places in North Africa. One such shipwreck was found off the coast of Tunisia, a shipwreck from a place called Mahdia, which also gives us some idea of the range of objects that the Romans required. So we know they were extremely fond of the capolavori, of the works that Pliny, for instance, lists in his natural history, that were made by all the famous artists like Polycletus and Lysippus and other guys like that. But they also were keen to acquire things that would furnish their villas, which we today do not necessarily regard as art, but which for the Romans and the furnishing of their villas and houses was also a very, very important element. And you see, for example, here on the left-hand side, a candelabra made of marble. The poor preservation here is obviously due to its having been in the water for a long time. So these candelabra, but also supports for tables and other pieces of furniture, basins for the gardens, like here on the right. Oops, this is strange. Oops, no, sorry. I think it works without the pointer. On the right-hand side, this little putto, as you can see, he is clearly, this is a modern support, of course, but as you can see from the figure how it is made, it was made to be sitting on something, and he is holding up his hands, and this can only have been made for a fountain, and he would be sitting where the water comes down, so he is made into an inhabitant of a garden, a kind of mythical inhabitant of a garden. We can also see some sculpture like this female bust here, which is badly damaged from having been underwater in parts. But as you can see, and it is also, of course, not a full statue, even though it must have belonged to one. And you can see in particular here on our left side that that this part has actually been worked with a very, very smooth kind of rim. And this is made in order to fix onto this part another piece of either marble, maybe colored marble, but also potentially of other materials. And equally, the lower part of the figure is worked in this same way. So the pieces of the sculpture that were dressed were probably created in some material that was colored, so that the dress would be colored and only the white body would emerge in white marble. I have here another two further items that were found in the same shipwreck. The figure of an Eros who is posing as an athlete, so he is crowning himself, but it's clearly an Eros, as we can see from the wings. And on the left-hand side, we see a Maenad, so one of the female followers of Dionysus, with the typical wreath in her hair. And not sure how well you can see that this is a curved piece of bronze which has been mounted on a modern wooden support, but this would have been part of a kline, of a dining couch, as the decoration of a piece of wooden or ivory furniture, but only the bronze has been preserved. So we can see from these shipwrecks the broad range of things that Romans purchased from the Greeks, and which they, in contrast to us in modern days normally, all called art. So art was, for the Romans, the stuff that came from Greece, and that was decorating houses and villas and public spaces. And they did not make they did not have these categories like we do in the modern world. Still, it is changing. Things are changing a little bit, but traditionally, art is large-scale sculptures, but not decorative things, not objects that could be used like tables and candelabras and furniture adornments. For the Romans, this difference did not exist, and the small-scale decorative things counted as much as art and were as precious as were the large-scale sculptures and the paintings. Now, moving forward, I would like to turn to the contexts in which the Romans displayed their art booty. Again, we know a lot about this from literary authors, and I didn't want to put lots of texts on the slide, but rather show you the material evidence that we've got. We know that the majority of sculptures and paintings that were taken from southern Italy and from Greece were displayed in public places in Rome, primarily in sanctuaries in Rome. And this is also, the reason for this is also that a lot of the majority of art that they took from the Greek East was taken from sanctuaries. And not only the Greeks, but also the Romans had the view that what was once dedicated to the gods was the property of the gods. So removing all this material from sanctuaries meant to deprive the gods of what was their property. And the feeling was that this could only be remedied by putting it again in public places and primarily in those that were considered sanctuaries. So it was given back to the gods, just not in Greece, but in Italy. But in the 1st century BCE, this changed slightly, and more of the generals who took booty also displayed part of this in their own villas, and some even in their country houses. When I'm talking about villas and houses, I'm not sure entirely what your background is. So we call normally houses or domus the houses in the cities, and villa the countryside houses, even when they were only just outside the cities. And at least in the late Republic and the early imperial period, there was an understanding that these two spaces also had different purposes. So the houses in the cities were the places where one should do business and not indulge in philosophy and poetry and art collecting, but that was where you would do business. And in the villas, those were the so the negotium, and in the villas, those were the places where for otium, for relaxation, for doing all the pleasurable things, and collecting art as much as engaging in poetry and philosophy and similar things was considered part of otium. And for that reason, most of the art ended up in villas instead of the houses inside the cities, although there were very notable exceptions. The point, however, is that in the 1st century BC, a lot of powerful Romans took some of this art from the public spaces or directly from Greece, and displayed that in their private properties. Augustus put an end to all this, and also affected a lot of returning of these sculptures into to the public, to the Roman citizens. His successors, Tiberius, then in particular Caligula and Nero, they reversed this trend. And they are being said by the ancient authors to have taken a lot of art from these public places back into their imperial villas and palaces. But after the death of Nero, Emperor Vespasian made a big gesture in restoring morals and good government in Rome again, and took lots of stuff from Nero's Domus Aurea, from Nero's Golden House, to again display things in the public realm in Rome. And one of those spaces that he had built specifically was the Templum Pacis, which is one of the imperial fora, which, however, was considered a sacred space, like the others were as well. And so the Templum Pacis ended up being one of the major display areas in Rome, public display areas in Rome, for the display of original Greek art. Now, very unfortunately, in the later 2nd century, I think in 193 or 94, the Templum Pacis burned down, and it burned with such a force that the heat melted down all the original bronze statues, or at least a very large number of original bronze statues from Greece that were on display there. But now comes a very interesting thing. After the fire, and in the late 2nd century, the whole setup was reconstructed again. new statue bases were created, and copies of these same famous artworks were created and set up again in the Forum Pacis. Also, these newly created replicas of the originals have been lost, but some of the statue bases have been preserved, and they are inscribed exactly as if they had displayed the original artworks. The fragments of these bases are now on display in the Mercati Traiani. You wouldn't normally notice them very much because they look rather battered, like this piece here on the left. So they don't look spectacular, but they are actually really important piece of evidence. This inscription can be reconstructed as being the basis for a statue of Hermes by one of the most famous Greek artists, Praxiteles. And you see the Greek inscribed in Greek letters, even though, you know, this was in the center of Rome. And there are further fragments of other statue bases, which also give us the names, and all these names on the statue bases are very well known from the writings of Pliny and of other authors as being the most famous names, and also the capolavori of those famous artists which were on display there and were recreated after the original statues have burned down. This is in fact a very interesting observation because it shows us something about the Romans' idea of originality. For us, it makes an enormous difference whether a statue is a true Michelangelo or a replica of a statue by Michelangelo. But for the Romans, they did obviously know the difference, and they appreciated the original works of art that came from Greece and were made by these artists. But replicas did not have the same bad reputation as they do today. And that in the Templum Pacis, these statues were recreated and displayed with inscriptions as if they were the originals was not just to cheat, was not just to pretend something that was the case. It also shows us that the Romans appreciated good replicas, well-made replicas. They really rated them very, very highly. And that also explains why we have so many replicas. Oh, this is just another example, you know, just to show you how many of those fragments have actually been recovered from the Templum Pacis, also in recent excavations. So this appreciation of replicas, which were still connected with the big names of Greek artists, also resulted in the existence of all these many replicas, for instance, of the Doryphoros, of Polycletus, which was originally probably the statue of an athlete. You know, these are just 3 examples, but there are, I have forgotten exactly how many, but I think it's 90 or even more replicas of this statue that have been found. So this is an enormous number. And these statues do not come from, you know, they are not sort of the middle class, poor man's substitute for original art, but these come from public places, spaces. They come from very rich Roman villas, so we can see the appreciation. Some come from imperial villas. The Villa Hadriana of the Emperor Hadrian was full of replicas of famous Greek artworks of the capolavori from Greece. So there was a true appreciation of these replicas. We will come back to this bust on the right-hand side, which is from the Villa dei Papiri near Herculaneum. And we can see that some of these replicas were even, oh, I can do a point. This is better. So, you know, some of these replicas were only partial, so that only in this case the head was copied, but with exact detail. So we could really count the individual strands of hair and would find them being exactly the same on all these replicas. And I'm showing another example here, the Amazon of the so-called type Shara. There are several Amazon statues, and this one is likely to have also been made by Polykleitos, even though we cannot be entirely sure. But the Romans are often known for just replicating statues. And you can read in particular in the more, you know, in scholarship of previous of the 20th century, essentially, you can often read that, you know, and that is also based on Pliny's judgment, one should admit, that the Romans, they didn't really know what to do. They didn't really know art. They were good at warfare and at administration, but with art, all they could do was commission them from Greek artists or replicate what the Greeks had done. But in the field of art, they were not terribly original. Nowadays, scholars know and have demonstrated that the Romans were actually incredibly innovative, that the idea that the Pompeian wall paintings were all based on famous Greek original paintings cannot be true for various reasons. This would take another lecture to demonstrate that in detail, but that this cannot be true, that the Romans took inspiration from Greek art and they replicated the style of Greek art in many instances, but then developed it further and adapted it to their own ideas. And one great example is a statue of Aphrodite that dates to the late classical or early Hellenistic period. One copy is preserved in the Museum of Naples and has been found in Capua. You see that statue on the left-hand side, a semi-nude Venus, who originally was holding the shield of Ares and was using that as a mirror. That is an idea we see in other contexts, that Aphrodite uses Ares' shield as a mirror to, you know, reflect herself in this. Now, what is really funny is how the Romans then adapted what must have been a very famous statue, even though we do not know the artist of the original statue, adapted this in various different ways. This bronze statue on the right was found in Brescia, in the Forum of Brescia. And as you can see from the wings here, this is no longer Aphrodite, but it is now Victory. And she is also holding a shield, unfortunately lost, but we can see that from the way her arms are held. But then in her right-hand side, she held a stylus to inscribe on the shield victories. So we see that the same kind of formula, the same type of statue, was modified, also dressed a bit more than Venus was, to make it into something else. But it must have been important to still see the quote. You know, we should look at this like we look at a quote from Homer in a text of some Roman author. This is similar, but it's not just Brescia. This statue on the left, the photograph is not particularly good, but the best I could find, this statue on the left is another, well, Victory or Venus, we do not know exactly, but a divinity, again, based on the same statue type, another divinity inscribing on the shield some text. And we can, because it's marble, we can still read the text. I hope you can see at least that there is a text, even though you surely can't read it. And this Venus is inscribing the praise of a local benefactor from the city of Perge, which is on the south coast of Turkey. So praise of this local benefactor who had paid for the baths or for some equipment of the baths. So again, another kind of variation of the same idea. And finally, you may be familiar with this detail here on the right. Oh, I forgot to put the writing underneath. This is a detail you surely have recognized it already from the column of Trajan in his forum. In the middle of the spiral that narrates his Dacian wars. After the end of the first Dacian war, we have Victoria again inscribing the shield. In this case, the writing must have been painted on and is not carved into the shield, but writing, documenting the victories of Trajan after the end of this war. Oh, I do have a final example, just to mention it very briefly. These are statue groups where the same idea, the same type of statue has even been combined with a statue of Ares. The position of the arms is more or less the same, but she is now embracing Ares. And Ares is also based on a famous statue, which I'm showing you here on the top right, which is the so-called Ares Borghese, because it was in the Borghese collection. And in this case, the couple of Venus and Ares, as a couple in love, have received portrait features of various individuals who pose as Ares and Aphrodite, use this mythological paradigm to express their own love towards each other, affection towards each other as a married couple. So I think these are beautiful examples to show how the Romans were not just replicating, as we have seen with the Doryphoros, but they were also creatively using this inspiration and using the quotes from the capolavori to then do something that suited their own needs. The use of Greek looted art was, in fact, a very controversial matter among the Romans, in particular when it was displayed in private contexts. And I've put here on the slide, and if anyone wants to have this PowerPoint, drop me an email and I'm happy to share this with you. We don't need to go through all the details. Essentially, we have here the same thing over and over again, how dangerous the collecting of art and the engagement with Greek cultural activities was to Roman morals. So the first reads, "They are dangers, believe me, those statues which have been brought into the city from Syracuse. For now I hear far too many people praising and marveling at the ornaments of Corinth and Athens and laughing at the terracotta antefixes of our Roman gods. So the Roman temples and Etruscan Italic temples all had terracotta decoration, which is actually beautiful, even though poorly preserved. But, you know, this is the worry that Roman traditions are being disregarded, but also a moral aspect from here in Livy. They, that is the statues and paintings from Syracuse, again, were no doubt the spoils of the enemy and were no doubt taken by right of war. So it's justified that they were taken. All the same, it was from these that one can trace the beginning of the craze for works of Greek art, and arising from that, the licentiousness with which all places everywhere, be they sacred or profane, were despoiled. And Plutarch thinks that prior to the sack of Syracuse, the Roman people had been accustomed to fighting or farming and had no experience with a life of softness and ease. So it is also, you know, losing the strength of what the Romans were proud of through engaging with all these Greek cultural activities. Nevertheless, these moralists were broadly disregarded. They make up the majority of our literary sources, but when we look at what the Roman elite meaning, you know, is both the powerful people, but also the rich people, which were not always identical, what they actually did, we can see that they all collected art. Cicero is condemning some of his contemporaries while at the same time filling his villas with art as well. And I would like to show you finally two examples of the way that art was displayed. I already mentioned that the paintings have not been preserved, and so for that reason, obviously, I cannot show you any examples of the display of original Greek paintings. But we do have beautiful examples of the imitation of the display of Greek art. And one very nice example from Rome, as I said, Pompeii is a complicated matter. So I'm showing you an example from Rome, which is a villa just outside the actual city. Here on the right bank of the Tiber in the Trans Tiberim, a villa, a suburban villa, as we would call it, which has been partially excavated and documented when the Villa Farnesina was built there. And so also the ancient villa is often called by shorthand as Villa Farnesina. And here in the plan on the top right, the black parts are those that have actually been excavated, and we can assume that the floor plan was originally symmetrical. So it was a very large villa fronting the Tiber, probably with a beautiful view across the Tiber on the field of Mars, here on the other side. And a 3D reconstruction of some of the paintings, which are now beautifully displayed in Palazzo Massimo in the museum in Rome on the top floor. And I would like to talk in particular about these two rooms, which were decorated in a very similar manner, with imitations of Greek paintings. I apologize for the writing of the Getty images across here. It's a bit of a nuisance, but it's in fact the best image of the room I could find. I should go and take my own photograph, actually, because you can see that room. And what you can see here is a collection of lots of different kinds of artworks and decoration in this room. But in various places, there are paintings being displayed. And these paintings are of very different character. You can see immediately, and we are showing a close-up in the moment, that there are different styles being imitated, with this central image looking very naturalistic, very colorful, a lot of shading of different colors, which is the style of painting that is chronologically already advanced. Let's say we would put the original in, the very late 4th century, maybe more into the Hellenistic period, whereas these other examples show a kind of style which is which is much more restrained in the use of color, which shows the figures in profile rather than at an angle. And those of you who know a little bit know Greek vase painting, it is actually the outline of faces as we find them on Greek vases, with a very heavy chin being characteristic of, say, the mid-5th century. So what we are having here is an imitation, also with a reduced color spectrum, an imitation of a Greek painting from the 5th century BC. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you a painting on marble from Herculaneum. So some of these paintings, these paintings were sometimes painted directly on the wall, sometimes on marble and framed so that they looked like panel paintings, this imitating a style which is which is more akin to vase painting from the late 5th century, so say from the 420s or a little bit later. This is the same room again from another angle, and we see the painting in the Hellenistic style here again. Another one that is similar to the one we have seen first. Also here, you see the faces and the figures completely in profile, with a little bit more of depth in the image. That is perhaps akin to the style of the 4th century BC. So we do have the imitation of Greek paintings, but in a very eclectic way. So not just from one particular time period, but from various different time periods. And we can assume that this is not just by accident, but that the Romans actually knew that art from Greece was different in the different centuries. So here, just another example of more colorful images, here displayed as if they were the original wooden paintings on wood, with the shutters that you could use to close them off to protect them from the light, which would make the colors fade. And where we have the imitation of these panel paintings, they painted the shutters to communicate the same kind of idea. Finally, I would like to move to the villa of the papyri and to some of the statue displays that show us the same kind of taste and attitude towards Greek art as we have seen in the Villa Farnesina, a very eclectic kind of taste. Very briefly on the villa itself, it was situated immediately outside the city of Herculaneum, which you see here. So Naples over there, Pompeii over here, Mount Vesuvius, and Herculaneum obviously also destroyed by Vesuvius. And just outside to the north of Herculaneum was an enormous villa, which has been recreated here on the left in the model, with a long front, a long sea front of over 220 meters. So that is absolutely enormous. I put here again some facts on the slides. The villa dates to the mid-1st century BC, was destroyed by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. We assume that the villa belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesonianus, who died in 42 BCE. So if it was his, the villa was built relatively shortly before his death. We know this person because he was the father-in-law of Caesar, the father of Caesar's third wife. Cicero is not thinking very highly of Calpurnius Piso. But we know, he thinks he was a very bad governor of Macedonia and Achaia. If it was his villa, we can say at least that he did not plunder these provinces because there was no original Greek piece of art found in the villa. But he admired Greece and some of its personnel enormously. The villa is very famous, not just because it is one of the very, very few Roman villas where we can reconstruct the display of art in the various spaces with great precision, but also because of the papyri that have given the villa its name. There were almost 1,000 papyri found there. The majority were Greek papyri. Only 60 were found that are written in Latin. Some scholars speculate that that there was also a Latin library, which is still somewhere underneath the, in the unexcavated parts of the villa. The excavation history is really interesting because, as you can see in the slide here on the top right, this is roughly the floor of the ancient floor level, and you can see the enormous amount of ashes that are on top of this villa. And so that made it almost impossible to excavate from the top down. So what they did in the 19th century was they started where they had somehow discovered walls and then excavated in tunnels along the walls, and then with a few tunnels crossing. And in this plan here, you can see one of those tunnels on the left-hand side in the photograph, and the plan at the bottom here, that the red lines are actually, no, sorry, the yellow brownish lines are all the tunnels which they dug, and the red lines is the outline of the architecture. So all these tunnels were dug into the tuff, and you see one of these entrances here in the slide. Modern excavations have taken place since 1999. As of yet not fully published, unfortunately, and it has been revealed that there were actually more areas. The villa was actually larger than thought until then. Watch this space. There is still a lot of interesting stuff to come out of this. If you want to get an impression of what this villa actually felt like as an architectural space, you may want to travel to the United States, to Malibu, where the rich patron J. Paul Getty built his own, what was intended as his own house. as a replica of the villa. So what it was later turned into a museum, but this museum was exactly replicating the outline of the villa. What we are seeing here is the very large peristyle. So this is the floor plan of the original Villa dei Papiri. And what we can see, this is the replication of this large peristyle with a water basin in the center. And we are seeing in this instance, the villa building in the background. And he also had replicas made in bronze of the statues that had been found in the Villa dei Papiri. So he really wanted to recreate this beautiful villa as his residence. And when you go there, you get a feel of what it was like to move in these spaces. Just very briefly on the papyri, which I have already mentioned, they are another testimony of a rich and powerful Roman person who was interested in a very wide range of cultural pursuits and had this library created for himself of papyrus rolls that copied Greek and a few Latin texts, most of them from the Hellenistic period, a lot of them to do with Epicurean philosophy. So those papyri that have already been read and identified as, you know, what they are about or what texts they are, a lot of them have been identified as concerning Epicurean philosophy. You see in the photo on the top what they looked like when they were excavated, and there are ongoing projects of how we may be able to read these papyrus rolls, because there are a lot of texts as well that have not been known yet. And there is great expectation that our knowledge of Greek philosophy and Greek literature will improve if we could actually read all those rolls. But they are very brittle. They are charred from the heat of the ashes. And so there is a lot of experimentation going on. Oh, and at the bottom there, I'm indicating where the library was situated. We actually have already seen this bust, this Herm portrait of the Doryphoros, and this one and a copy of the head and one of the Amazons, which we've also already seen, were found in a space, a peristyle, a smaller peristyle, which was decorated with lots of sculptures, all heads, no statues. Yeah, we have seen the Doryphoros before, and here we have the Amazon in the type Shara with our bronze again in the same. So these stand in for the copying of famous or Greek originals, which we can identify as such. There are also lots of portraits across the whole villa, portraits of both Greek intellectuals and Greek Hellenistic rulers. So this owner of the villa was obviously massively impressed by the Greek kings and some Greek generals, and may actually have been aspiring to become someone like them. And we know in the 1st century BCE, some of the Roman generals, you know, Marius, Sulla, Pompey the Great, also Caesar, they imitated the Hellenistic kings and Hellenistic generals in a number of different ways, and were obviously very impressed. And the owner of this villa, possibly Calpurnius Piso, put portraits of these admired generals and kings as well as the statues and busts of intellectuals up in his villa. These are three probably intellectuals which we cannot identify. We think that they may be intellectuals because of the style of dress, because of the wreath that these two are wearing, and this guy here wears a cloak with a bare chest without an undergarment, and so this is a dress type that would be typical of intellectuals, but we can't identify them. In this same peristyle, there was, however, also some Hellenistic prince. We can imagine that he must have been that because this is a cloak that is closed over the shoulder with a fibula, and that is a military cloak. We know that, and so that can't be an intellectual, but must be some, some perhaps military figure, prince, because he looks so young, someone like that. Then a very strange figure here, which looks quite exotic and has some similarities to the portraits of Hellenistic queens. So she may be a Hellenistic queen as well, or else one of the Ptolemies with an unusual hairstyle. We can't really identify these and only speculate. Then we have further Hellenistic rulers in the atrium here. Which is quite remarkable because traditionally the atrium was the place where the Romans displayed their ancestral portraits, as at least in their domus, in the city houses, they would display their ancestors who held offices and served as models for their children. And also served to display the greatness of the of the family to visitors. In this case, the atrium was used for the display of various of more Hellenistic rulers. The one on the top left and on the top right. On the bottom right, they are probably Ptolemies. They can't be identified precisely, but because of their softly features, which is a characteristic of many of the Ptolemies, they may be Ptolemaic rulers, and another bust, which may be a Hellenistic queen, even though, the head is lost and we can't be entirely sure. Then we have also, as I already said, lots of intellectuals, many of which we can identify because they are replicas of famous portraits of these Greek intellectuals. But they are, but most of them are replicas in small format and must have been displayed on either on tables or maybe on shelves on the walls. These have not been recovered in the excavation, so we don't know exactly how they were displayed. But these ones were displayed in a room that looked out in one direction onto the small peristyle and in the other direction onto the large peristyle. Must have been a representation room for the reception of noble friends and guests. So here we are looking at Epicurus, so at the philosopher whose school, has produced the writings that were in the library. And on the right-hand side, we have Demosthenes, the famous orator of the 4th century. So we are not only looking at philosophers, but also at intellectuals more broadly. We do have also small busts in this same room of some of the ancestors or contemporaries of the owners, which I'm showing here. But these 4 portraits are the only Roman portraits that have been found in the entire villa with its multiple sculptures, which is quite interesting. Then in the here between the columns stood an enormous colossal marble Athena, which is imitating the style of Greek sculpture from the 6th century BC. Moving on to the small room just north of the tablinum, we have more small bronze portraits, another Epicurus. So some of these individuals appear several times. We have the philosopher Zenon here at the bottom, Hermarchus, another Epicurean philosopher. So Zenon is a Stoic philosopher. The owner wasn't only into Epicureanism. And then we have Demosthenes again. So, and what is really useful for us is that these were all inscribed, and that helps us also to identify other large-scale replicas of these same intellectuals from Greece. Finally, moving into the large garden peristyle. I'm not going to show you all the sculptures because they are too many. There were, various different kinds of sculptures. This plan here, all the dots are fine spots of sculptures and display of sculptures. This is a drawing that shows, what it may have looked like, with some of the sculptures being displayed here in the portico, others in the garden. And these double herms were displayed alongside the pool and connected by shallow fences. Again, we have seen this slide again, where in the Getty Villa this display has been imitated. We see the range of sculptures. There are some Dionysiac sculptures here. An athlete, a Hermes, as we can see from the winged shoes. There were athletes as well, like these two runners. There were also some quite, obscene, one might say, garden sculptures displayed in between, but also very austere-looking peplos statues in a classical style in the portico. And last but not least, a statue of Aeschines, another orator from the fourth century Athens, and a statue with a Roman portrait, but displayed in the kind of dress with sandals and just the cloak draped in the Greek style, who must be one of the inhabitants or owners of the villa, who presented himself like a Greek intellectual. So I will stop here and hope to have given you some insight into Roman attitudes towards Greek sculpture, in both their interest in collecting original Greek sculpture, in replicating them, in developing them further, and also in the eclectic taste which the Romans had. So sometimes you read that Pompeii, everything is so eclectic, and we frown upon eclecticism. We think, or we used to think, that the purism of style would be the ideal, and eclecticism is a sign of poor taste of the uneducated classes. Clearly for the Romans, this is not the case. They loved eclecticism. They took whatever they fancied and enjoyed the multiplicity of things they could do with being inspired by Greek art. I stop here. If you have any questions, please do ask, also in Italian if you prefer. If there's anyone online who would like to ask a question, please just speak, because I can't see you. I can't see if you raise your virtual hand. So please just shout.
Scusi,
Sì?
posso chiedere, ha parlato all'inizio del Tempio della Pace che era andato a fuoco ed
Mh-mh.
era stato ricostruito, cioè non ho capito, è andato bruciato alla fine del secondo secolo e ricostruito dopo con repliche poi delle statue? Ho capito che le
Sì,
statue bronzee si sono fuse tutte.
sì.
Ecco, ma cioè, come facciamo a sapere che erano esatte repliche di quelle precedenti? Ne abbiamo fonti letterarie che ce le descrivono, che ce le indicano, quelle che sono andate fuse?
Sì, u un una buona domanda. Uhm, non possiamo sapere, per certo che questi erano repliche, esatte, ma, abbiamo queste basi con le iscrizioni che suggeriscono, che siano una imitazione, una replicazione della mostra originale. E sappiamo anche che i romani hanno fatto le repliche, di questi capolavori. L'hanno fatto per le ville, come ho detto, ma anche per luoghi pubblici, a Roma, ma anche fuori Roma, e quindi sappiamo che, uhm, c'erano già repliche, molto precisi delle statue esposti nel Templum Pacis, e quindi è molto, molto verosimile che il momento in quanto hanno ricreato lo spazio ancora, hanno provato a farlo, il più preciso possibile. Ma queste statue erano ancora in bronzo e sono perduti, e quindi non possiamo, essere assolutamente sicuri.
Grazie. Mi scusi, ancora una
Sì?
domanda. Questo gusto per l'eclettismo, no, se ho ben capito, lei alla fine ha detto: "Noi riteniamo che ciò che è di stile puro, il purismo, sia l'ideale, mentre abbiamo sempre dato un significato negativo all'eclettismo." E questo
Mh-mh.
è vero un po' in tutta la storia, l'impostazione della storia dell'arte anche dei secoli successivi, non solo dell'età classica. Ecco, però
Sì.
questo gusto per l'eclettismo nel mondo romano, cioè si sviluppa quando? Diciamo da quale periodo? Perché quando Marcello conquista la Sicilia, cioè cominciano a prendere, come dire, a saccheggiare santuari, templi e a portare a Roma a man bassa statua. Ecco, poi questo gusto per l'eclettismo si sviluppa ovviamente cioè quando in un secondo tempo siamo in grado di capire, o possiamo dire a posteriori soltanto i romani avevano questo gusto per l'eclettismo, per loro era normale, anche se noi tradizionalmente non lo reputiamo in modo positivo. Ecco, era questo che volevo capire. Quando se è possibile stabilire, cioè capire quando si sviluppa questo gusto per l'eclettismo,
Mh-mh.
o se, diciamo, se ho ben capito, però questo gusto per l'eclettismo almeno nel primo secolo dopo Cristo, in età Giulio Claudia, è già affermato, è già presente. Ecco, era questo che volevo capire un po' come si sviluppa questo gusto.
Sì, anche questo in una domanda molto interessante, anche per capire le origini del nostro gusto, perché l'idea di che ecletticismo è una cosa negativa è molto recente. Io non sono abbastanza esperte per dirvi esattamente quando si è sviluppato, ma per la maggioranza del passato ecletticismo era la situazione normale, non esisteva questa idea dell'arte puro, di solo un periodo, di solo uno stile. Anche se pensiamo della situazione trovati dai Romani nei santuari e nelle città, nei palazzi che hanno saccheggiato, hanno trovato già una un grande gamma dell'arte diversa perché, le uhm, le donazioni alle offerte alle divinità, uhm, sono fatta, tra i secoli. Un santuario, diciamo come quello di Siracusa, è iniziato già nel VI secolo avanti e accumulato l'arte, uhm, l'arte, tra le secoli, e quindi i santuari erano una collezione dell'arte eclettico da diversi periodi, anche di, diversi, oggetti, di diversi, temi di sculture o pitture. E quindi, uhm, quando i romani hanno portato via, queste opere d'arte e hanno messo, in esposizione nei loro spazi, non hanno creato una cosa, diversa da quella nella Grecia, ma essenzialmente lo stesso. Quindi per i romani, come per i greci, l'ecletticismo era la cosa normale e è un'idea moderna, questa idea del collezionismo di solo uno stile, che le nostre case devono essere decorate con solo immobili di un certo periodo. Quindi una domanda molto interessante. Se non ci sono, vi auguro una buona serata. Grazie per la vostra attenzione e alla prossima volta. Arrivederci.
Sorry, scusi, mi scusi una cosa, sarà possibile avere
Sì?
mi scusi, sarà possibile avere il PDF come ci hanno detto ci daranno altri docenti?
Sì, devo solo indicare che io non, ho i diritti delle immagini, quindi vi prego di non mettere, né la presentazione insieme, ma neanche le immagini open access sull'internet. Perché questi sono scannerizzato, tanti di questo dalle pubblicazioni e io non ho i diritti. Possiamo tutti noi usarlo per la didattica,
Sì, sì.
ma non per pubblicarlo in altri contesti. Ma altrettanto sono contenta di condividerlo. Io non ho le vostre dati di contatto, quindi, vi prego di mandarmi un'email e poi, posso mandare il PowerPoint o anche un PDF come
Sì,
preferite.
adesso.